The wind carried stories across the plains, but none as unexpected as the one that unfolded during the winter of 1878 in the remote valley of Willow Creek. When Sarah Collingwood ventured out into the blinding snowstorm to secure her livestock, she never imagined she would find more than just her wayward calf. What awaited her in the driving snow would challenge everything she had been taught to believe, forcing her to make a choice between the safety of conformity and the peril of compassion. What happened in the days that followed would forever change, not just her life, but the very fabric of understanding between two worlds, long divided by bloodshed and mistrust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blizzard descended on Willow Creek like a predator, swift, merciless, and hungry. It devoured the Kansas landscape beneath sheets of white, transforming familiar hills into alien drifts that shifted and grew with each gust. The temperature plummeted as daylight faded, the kind of cold that didn't just bite at exposed skin, but seemed to seep into bone and settle there like a permanent resident. Sarah Collingwood stood at her cabin window, one hand pressed against the rough-hewn frame, watching as the world disappeared beneath the storm's assault. At 32, she wore solitude like a second skin, neither embracing nor rejecting it, simply acknowledging its presence as she did the changing seasons. Her honey-brown hair was secured in a practical braid that hung down her back, and her eyes, a weathered blue that had seen too much hardship to maintain their once bright hue, narrowed against the white emptiness beyond the glass. "Fool calf," she muttered, spotting movement near the southern edge of her property. One of her youngest cattle had wandered outside the barn before she could finish securing the doors. Now it stumbled through snow that already reached its knees. Disoriented by the whiteout conditions, Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, pulling on layers that offered little beauty but promised survival. Woolen stockings, a heavy flannel dress, leather boots mended 3 times over. She wrapped herself in her late husband's coat, the shoulders too broad, the sleeves too long, but the fabric still carried the faint smell of tobacco and pine that had once been James'. 5 years since the fever had taken him, yet his presence lingered in the practical items he'd left behind, tools that still fit her hands, a coat that still kept her warm. "Won't be long," she told the empty room, a habit formed from years of speaking to a ghost who never answered back. She secured a rope around her waist, tying the other end to the porch rail, an old plains trick to avoid becoming lost between house and barn during whiteouts. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, the wind driving crystalline shards against her face. She pulled her scarf higher, tucked her chin down, and began the arduous trek toward the disoriented calf. Each step required deliberate effort, her boots breaking through the crust of ice that had formed over deeper snow. 20 yards became an expedition, the howling wind disorienting her sense of direction until only the taut rope at her waist assured her that home remained within reach. The calf had stopped moving, its dark form barely visible against the swirling white. Sarah reached it and ran her gloved hands over its trembling body, murmuring reassurances that were instantly swept away by the wind. She looped a second rope around its neck and began the return journey, tugging the reluctant animal behind her. That's when she saw it, a darker shape in the snow, larger than the calf, motionless where the edge of her property met the beginning of the forest. Sarah hesitated, the rational part of her mind urging retreat to the safety of her cabin. But something about the stillness of the form triggered the compassion that hardship had failed to erode from her character. "Just get the calf to the barn first," she told herself, practical even in her curiosity. The small barn offered blessed relief from the wind. Sarah quickly secured the calf in its stall, checking that the other animals were safely sheltered before steeling herself to venture out again. She tightened her scarf, tested the rope at her waist, and stepped back into the tempest. The shape remained where she had spotted it, now partly covered by fresh snow. As she drew nearer, her throat tightened. A man lay face down in the drift, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. His black hair, longer than any white settler would wear, was adorned with small beads that clinked together in the wind. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, brushing snow from his shoulders. His skin was a deep copper tone beneath a dangerous bluish tinge of cold. His clothing, leather leggings, a fringed hunting shirt embellished with dyed porcupine quills, identified him immediately. Kiowa, one of the warrior tribe that settlers in these parts had been taught to fear since childhood. She hesitated only a moment before pressing her fingers to his neck, finding a pulse so faint it might have been her own hope beating against her fingertips. He was alive, but barely. A dark stain had frozen along his left side. Blood, she realized, from what appeared to be a bullet wound. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to leave him. That's what anyone in Willow Creek would advise. The tenuous peace between settlers and the native tribes was built on distance, not mercy. Helping him could be seen as betrayal by her neighbors. Not helping him was a betrayal of something deeper, something that had guided Sarah through her own darkest hours. "Lord, help me," she whispered, though she hadn't darkened the church door. Since they'd buried James, the man was heavier than she'd anticipated, dead weight against the pulling snow. Sarah hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and began to drag him toward the barn, knowing the cabin was too far in these conditions. Each step became a negotiation with her own strength, her boots failing to find purchase, then suddenly breaking. Through to solid ground. The rope around her waist grew taut, then slack as she changed direction and fought against the wind that seemed determined to keep her from reaching safety. By the time she reached the barn door, sweat froze against her skin despite the bitter cold. She maneuvered him inside, managing to avoid disturbing the animals as she cleared a space in an empty stall and laid fresh straw for bedding. The barn lantern cast yellow light across his features as she removed her mittens to better examine. His wound, his face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, features that might have been carved from the red earth itself. Sarah guessed him to be close to her own age, perhaps younger. His breath came in shallow puffs, too rapid, too labored. She carefully turned him to access the wound, finding an entry hole in his side just below his ribs. No exit wound, which meant the bullet remained inside. Sarah had helped the local doctor enough times during James's illness to know the basics of wound care. She hurried to the cabin, following her rope through the blizzard, and returned with supplies, clean cloths, whiskey, her sewing kit, bandages, and several of the herbal preparations she'd learned to make from an old woman who lived beyond town. She cut away the frozen fabric around the wound, cleaned it as best she could, and probed gently for the bullet. The man remained unconscious, which was a mercy given what she needed to do. When her fingers located the small metal intrusion, she used her smallest knife to carefully extract it, dropping the misshapen lead onto the straw beside her. "There," she murmured, applying a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to staunch the bleeding before stitching the wound closed with neat, small sutures. She bandaged him with strips of clean linen, then covered him with spare blankets kept in the barn for emergency winter births. Only when the medical necessities were addressed did the full weight of her actions settle upon her shoulders. She had brought an injured Kiowa warrior onto her property, a man who might be wanted by the army, who might have been shot while raiding a settlement, who might have killed settlers himself. The town of Willow Creek, though small, maintained its fierce vigilance against native encroachment. If they discovered what she'd done, Sarah pushed the thought aside. The storm would keep everyone homebound for at least a day, possibly more. By then, she would figure out what to do next. She tended her animals with mechanical efficiency, her mind churning through possibilities, none of which seemed to lead to a clean resolution. When the barn was settled for the night, she checked on her patient once more. His breathing seemed steadier, though fever had begun to flush his skin. She left water and additional blankets within reach should he wake. "Don't die," she told him, uncertain whether she spoke out of compassion or self-interest. A dead Kiowa on her property would be only marginally less problematic than a living one. The trek back to her cabin was a blind journey through white fury. The rope her only guide, as the world beyond arm's length had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Inside, Sarah stoked the fire, shed her frozen outer garments, and poured herself a small measure of whiskey. The amber liquid burned a path down her throat, warming her from within as the fire warmed her skin. She slept poorly that night, waking at every sound, imagining the creak of the cabin's timbers to be approaching hoofbeats or the groan of the wounded man taking his last breath. When morning broke, the storm continued unabated, the world beyond her window an impenetrable wall of white. Sarah dressed quickly, prepared a pot of broth and a basket of medical supplies, and ventured out into the storm once more. The barn offered relative warmth and welcome shelter from the howling wind. She found her patient exactly as she'd left him, though his color seemed improved. As she knelt beside him to check his bandages, his eyes fluttered open. They were the darkest brown she'd ever seen, so deep they appeared almost black in the dim light. He focused on her face with an intensity that made her instinctively recoil, then glanced toward the pitchfork leaning against the nearby wall. His gaze followed hers, understanding evident in the slight nod he gave. He was too weak to be a threat, and they both knew it. "I'm going to check your wound," Sarah said, enunciating each word though she had no idea if he understood English. The man remained still as she unwrapped the bandages, revealing the angry red line of stitches surrounded by inflamed skin. The wound looked clean, no signs of serious infection yet. She applied fresh poultice and wrapped it with clean bandages. "You need to eat," she said, offering the cup of broth. He struggled to sit upright, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah helped prop him against the stall wall. He accepted the broth with a dignity that belied his circumstances, nodding once in what she took to be thanks. His hands were strong despite his weakened state, the fingers adorned with two simple rings, made of some dark metal she couldn't identify. "Do you understand me?" she asked when he had finished the broth. Yes. His voice was rough, whether from disuse or pain she couldn't tell. Why help? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Sarah busied herself collecting the empty cup and adjusting blankets while formulating an answer. "You were dying," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "I couldn't just leave you in the snow." He studied her for a long moment. "Others would. I'm not like others." A hint of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps respect, flickered in his eyes. "No," he agreed. "Not others. I'm Sarah." She offered, though immediately questioned the wisdom of giving her name. He seemed to weigh something in his mind before responding. "Ahote," he said, touching his chest lightly. "Ahote," she repeated, the unfamiliar name awkward on her tongue. "What does it mean?" "Restless one," he replied. Then, unexpectedly, "Your name?" "Sarah means princess in the old language," she said, "though I'm about as far from royalty as one can get." His expression remained impassive, but she sensed he was cataloguing every word, every movement. "Who shot you?" She asked the question that had plagued her throughout the night. Ahote's face hardened. "Men from fort. U.S. soldiers." Sarah's stomach clenched. Army involvement complicated matters exponentially. If they were tracking him... "Were you alone?" she asked, thinking of the possibility of other Kiowa warriors nearby. "Hunting party," he said. "4, separated in a storm after soldiers came. Others went north, back to winter camp. I came south, and ended up half dead on my property." Sarah concluded. "The storm likely saved you from being followed." He nodded once, then grimaced, pain evident in the tightening around his eyes. Sarah offered him willow bark tea for the discomfort, which he accepted without comment. "Why were the soldiers shooting at you?" she pressed. "Was your hunting party on reservation land?" A flash of anger crossed his features. "Treaty says we can hunt ancestral grounds in winter. Soldiers say treaty changed." Always changing what paper says. Sarah couldn't argue with that assessment. The government's agreements with the native tribes were notoriously fluid, especially when valuable resources were discovered on designated tribal lands. "The storm will last another day at least," she said, changing the subject. "You need to rest and heal before you can travel." They both recognized the unspoken reality that he couldn't stay indefinitely. His presence put them both in danger, him from the law, her from both legal repercussions and the judgment of her neighbors. "2 days," he said. "Then I go." "If you can walk by then," Sarah agreed, knowing that bullet wounds didn't heal on a predetermined schedule. As she rose to leave, he caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Why?" he asked again, the question loaded with more than its single word conveyed. Sarah looked down at his hand on her arm. The contrast of his copper skin against her paler tone, the strange intimacy of contact with someone unknown yet dependent on her mercy. The truth came to her lips unbidden. "Because everyone deserves compassion," she said, "and because I know what it is to be alone when the world turns cold." He released her then, settling back against the stall wall. As Sarah walked away, she felt his eyes on her, assessing, wondering, perhaps judging. She couldn't blame him for his suspicion. Trust between their peoples had been broken too many times to expect it now. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, the wind driving snow into drifts that reshaped the landscape hourly. Sarah followed her rope back to the cabin, grateful for its guidance as visibility remained near zero. She spent the afternoon checking her supplies, mending clothes by the fire, and trying to ignore the growing anxiety that accompanied her decision to shelter the wounded Kiowa. When evening approached, she returned to the barn with a heartier stew, fresh bandages, and a growing list of questions that warred with her better judgment. She found Ahote sitting upright, his breathing steadier, though pain still etched lines around his mouth. "You should be lying down," she admonished, setting her basket aside. "Sitting is better for breathing," he replied. His English, though limited, was better than she'd initially assumed. Sarah nodded, understanding the medical logic. "I brought food," she said, offering the bowl of rabbit stew. He accepted it with the same quiet dignity he'd shown earlier. They sat in silence as he ate, the only sounds coming from the occasional shifting of animals in their stalls and the relentless howling of the wind outside. "Storm is messenger," Ahote said suddenly. "Brings warning." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Warning of what?" "Change coming," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the wound in his side. "Blood on snow always means change." Despite herself, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd lived on the frontier long enough to respect the wisdom of those who read the land signs more fluently than any book. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Not all change is bad," she offered. Ahote's expression suggested he had seen little evidence to support her optimism, but he didn't contradict her. Instead, he reached carefully into a small pouch tied at his waist and withdrew something that caught the lantern light. "For helping," he said, extending his hand. In his palm lay a small carving, an eagle rendered in dark wood, its wings partially extended as if preparing for flight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each feather Distinct, the bird's eyes seeming to hold wisdom beyond its wooden form. Sarah hesitated. "I didn't help you for payment." "Not payment," he corrected. "Recognition." Understanding the significance of the gesture, she accepted the carving, running her finger along the smooth curve of a wing. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Did you make this?" He nodded. "Eagle carries prayers to the Creator, watches over those who walk alone." The sentiment struck something deep within Sarah, a recognition of the solitary path she'd walked since James's death. "Thank you," she said, closing her fingers around the small sculpture. That night marked a shift between them. Not friendship, nothing so defined, but a tentative accord built on mutual recognition of the other's humanity. As the blizzard raged into its second night, howling across the Kansas plains with undiminished fury, Sarah returned to her empty cabin with the wooden eagle clutched in her hand, a talisman against the isolation that had become her constant companion. She placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, its carved eyes watching over her as she settled into the rocking chair, mending in her lap, thoughts far from the neat stitches her fingers created. Outside, the world remained buried, beneath nature's onslaught, hiding for now the evidence of her decision. But storms, like secrets, eventually passed. And when this one cleared, Sarah knew her life would never be quite the same. What she couldn't possibly know was how soon that change would arrive, or the form it would take when the snow finally ceased and the sun broke through to reveal tracks. In the fresh snow, tracks leading directly to her door. The third morning dawned with startling clarity, the storm having exhausted itself sometime during the night. Sunlight sparkled across the transformed landscape, turning ordinary fields into a blinding expanse of white that stretched toward the horizon. The temperature remained bitter, but the silence after days of howling wind felt almost holy in its completeness. Sarah stood on her porch, coffee mug warming her hands, surveying the damage. Drifts had piled against the north side of the cabin, nearly reaching the eaves in places. The barn was half buried, only its upper structure and roof visible above the snow. She would need to dig paths to reach her animals and check on her patient. That's when she saw them, tracks leading from the tree line directly to her property, not the meandering trail of deer or the scattered imprints of wild turkeys, but the deliberate, even spacing of horses carrying riders. They approached from the east, circled her cabin once, then headed toward the barn before veering back into the forest to the north. Sarah's coffee turned cold in her hands. Someone had come while she slept, examining her property, perhaps even looking through windows. They hadn't announced themselves or knocked on her door, just watched, assessed, and departed. She set the mug down with trembling hands and hurried inside to retrieve her husband's rifle. The Winchester had been a wedding gift from James's father, who had insisted no frontier home was secure without protection. She'd fired it exactly 3 times in her life. Once, when James taught her its operation, once to dispatch a rabid fox that threatened her chickens, and once in warning when drifters had lingered too long near her property during her first year of widowhood. The gun felt awkward in her hands as she loaded it, but its weight provided a strange comfort as she made her way through the snow toward the barn. The drifts reached mid-thigh in places, forcing her to lift her knees high with each step, an exhausting process that left her breathless by the time she reached the barn door. Inside, the animals greeted her with anxious movements and hungry sounds. She fed them quickly before turning her attention to the stall where she'd left Ahote. It was empty. "Ahote," she called, her voice echoing in the barn's wooden hollow. Movement in the hayloft caught her attention. She raised the rifle, instinctively, then lowered it when she recognized the Kiowa warrior. He was standing at the edge of the loft, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart stumble in her chest. "Riders came," he said without preamble. 3, Sarah nodded. "I saw their tracks. Did they come inside? No. Circled barn. Looked through cracks. He descended the ladder with careful movements that betrayed his continuing pain. Army scouts. How can you be sure? Boots, horses, way they move. He reached the ground and leaned against a post for support. They will return. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter air. We need to get you out of here, she said, thinking aloud. But you're in no condition to travel far, especially in this snow. My people will. Come, Ahote said with quiet confidence. Soon. Sarah stared at him. How would they know where to find you? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Storm ended. They follow my path. They know I live. How could they possibly know that? Smoke. And from your chimney. Too much for a woman alone. The simplicity of the observation startled her. Of course, anyone familiar with her habits would notice the increased smoke from her fireplace, necessary to keep the wounded man from developing fever. It was the kind of detail that would mean nothing to strangers, but everything to those who knew the patterns of the land and its inhabitants. If your people come, and the army's scouts return at the same time, she didn't need to finish the thought. The potential for bloodshed hung in the air between them. Must leave before dark, Ahote said, confirming her fears. Go to the meeting. Place north. 2 hours ride. You can barely stand, Sarah protested, and the snow is deep. You'll reopen your wound or freeze before you make it halfway. He straightened, pride evident in the set of his shoulders. Have survived worse. Sarah recognized the stubborn determination in his stance. It mirrored her own, when faced with challenges too great to overcome alone, but too necessary to abandon. She made a decision then, one that defied logic but answered a deeper call. I'll take you, she said, in the sled. I can get you to the meeting place. Surprise flickered across his features, followed quickly by wary assessment. Why risk? The question hung between them, fraught with complexities neither could fully articulate. Why risk her safety, her reputation, perhaps even her life to help a man whose people were considered enemies by her own? Sarah herself wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Because it's the right thing to do, she said finally, and because I'd hoped someone would do the same for me if our situations were reversed. Ahote studied her face, searching for deceit or hidden motive. Finding none, he nodded once. We leave at midday. Scouts will rest until then. Sarah spent the morning in careful preparation, packing the small wooden sled with blankets and provisions. She dressed in her warmest clothes, woolen layers beneath, James's old buckskin coat above. She strapped snowshoes to her boots, knowing she would need to break trail for the draft horse that would pull the sled. She helped Ahote from the barn to the sled, watching as he fought to hide his pain beneath a mask of stoicism. Once settled among the blankets, some of the tension eased from his face, though his eyes remained alert, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Ready? Sarah asked, securing the last rope. Yes. He gestured toward the trees east of the property. Not that way. North first, then circle west. She nodded, understanding his strategy. The tracks would be harder to follow if they didn't head directly toward their destination. Sarah took up the horse's lead and began the arduous journey, each step requiring careful placement to avoid sinking too deeply into the drifts. The going was slow, the horse struggling against the resistance of packed snow. The afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the white expanse, beautiful in its severity. Sarah's breath formed clouds that dissipated into the crystal air, her muscles burning with exertion as she forged a path through virgin snow. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of the sled runners and the labored breathing of woman and horse. The trees grew denser as they moved away from Sarah's cleared land, offering some shelter from the biting wind, but making progress more difficult as she navigated between trunks and low-hanging branches. "Stop!" Ahote said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah halted, turning to find him alert, head tilted slightly as if listening to something beyond her perception. "What is it?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle. "Secured to the sled. Riders. Far still, but coming." He gestured for her to continue. "Must move faster." Sarah urged the horse forward with renewed urgency, her snowshoes finding purchase on the packed trail they'd created. The sled moved with greater ease now on the compressed snow, but not quickly enough to outpace mounted pursuers. They came to a small clearing where a frozen creek cut through the landscape. Ahote pointed to a ridge beyond it. "There, among rocks. Hidden path." Sarah nodded, guiding the horse across the ice with careful steps. The animal was nervous, sensing the tension in her movements. As they reached the middle of the creek, a sound carried on the wind, the distant but unmistakable whinny of another horse. "They've picked up our trail," she said, her voice tight with fear. Ahote was already moving, pushing aside blankets to reach for the rifle. "Go," he urged. "Leave me here. I will delay them." "No," Sarah said firmly, pulling the horse forward with determined strides. "We're almost there." The ridge loomed before them, a jumble of snow-covered rocks and stunted pines that offered the promise of concealment. Sarah's legs trembled with fatigue as she guided the horse up the incline, each step more difficult than the last. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more distinct, voices calling to each other, the crunch of hooves breaking through crusted snow. "There!" Ahote pointed to a narrow gap between two boulders, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. "Through there." Sarah maneuvered the sled as close as possible, then helped Ahote to his feet. His face was pale with pain and cold, but determination burned in his eyes as he leaned against her. Together they stumbled through the gap into a sheltered ravine beyond, the horse and sled barely fitting through the narrow passage. The ravine opened into a small valley cradled between rocky outcroppings, invisible from the surrounding forest. Here the snow was shallower, swept by wind into sporadic drifts, rather than the uniform blanket that covered the open lands. At the far end, Sarah could see the glow of a small fire and the silhouettes of several figures who rose at their approach. "My people," Ahote said, relief evident in his voice. 4 Kiowa warriors moved toward them, weapons ready but not raised. They took in the scene. Their wounded companions supported by a white woman, the laden sled, the exhausted horse, with expressions that shifted from wariness to surprise to cautious acceptance. The oldest of the group, a man with silver streaking his braided hair, stepped forward. "Ahote," he said, his voice rich with emotion. "We thought you lost to the storm." "Nearly was," Ahote replied in English, perhaps for Sarah's benefit. "This woman saved me, healed my wounds, brought me here when soldiers searched her home." The older man turned his attention to Sarah, studying her with eyes that seemed to look beyond her surface to something deeper within. "I am Keme, elder of Ahote's clan," he said, his English careful but clear. "You have done what few of your people would." Sarah nodded, uncertain how to respond to the formal acknowledgement. "I did what anyone should do," she said finally. A younger warrior snorted softly at this, clearly disagreeing with her assessment of her people's likely behavior. Kim silenced him with a gesture. "Your name?" he asked. "Sarah Collingwood." Kimmy nodded, as if committing it to memory. "The soldiers who hunt Ahote. They are close?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, glancing back toward the gap through which they'd entered. "Less than half an hour behind us, I'd guess." A swift conversation in Kiowa followed, too rapid for Sarah to discern meaning from the few words she recognized. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, 2 helping Ahote toward the fire, while the others began obliterating signs of their presence. Keme gestured for Sarah to follow. "Come, we must be away from here before they arrive." Sarah hesitated, suddenly aware of the enormity of her situation. She had delivered Ahote to his people as promised, but now found herself deep in unfamiliar territory with night approaching and hostile soldiers on her trail. To return alone would mean facing questioning, possibly even accusations of aiding an enemy of the United States government. Keme seemed to read her thoughts. "You cannot go back now," he said. "Not tonight. The soldiers would see your tracks. Leading here, then returning. They would know you helped him escape." The truth of his words settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She had made her choice when she first pulled Ahote from the snow. Everything that followed had been the inevitable consequence of that single act of compassion. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we move to our winter camp," Kem said. "You will come with us. When it is safe, we will help you return." It wasn't really a request, Sarah realized, though it was delivered without threat. It was simply the only path forward that didn't end in disaster for all concerned. She nodded her agreement, and Keme called out instructions to the others. The small caravan set out within minutes. 5 mounted warriors, Ahote secured on a travois behind one, horse and Sarah riding her own draft animal, the sled abandoned as too cumbersome for the journey ahead. They traveled north and west through increasingly rugged terrain, following game trails and frozen waterways where the snow lay thinner. As darkness descended, Sarah found herself in a world utterly foreign to her experience. The plains gave way to rocky foothills, the landscape a study in shadow and pale moonlight. The warriors moved with confidence through territory they clearly knew intimately, occasionally conferring in low voices, but mostly traveling in silence. Ahote rode ahead of her, his wounded form secured to the travois, with careful attention to his comfort. Occasionally he would turn to check on her, their eyes meeting briefly before he faced forward again. In those moments, Sarah felt an unspoken communication, acknowledgement of their shared journey, recognition of the boundaries they had both crossed. The Kiowa winter camp appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge shortly before midnight, a collection of hide lodges nestled in a protected valley beside a small, unfrozen stream. Smoke rose from central fire holes, and figures moved about in the moonlight, alerted to their approach by sentries positioned along the ridge. As they entered the camp, Sarah felt the weight of curious eyes upon her. Children peeked from behind lodge flaps. Women paused in their work to watch the strange procession. Men approached with expressions ranging from hostility to guarded interest. She kept her gaze forward, her back straight, despite the exhaustion that threatened to topple her from the horse. Kem raised his hand, issuing a brief explanation in Kiowa that Sarah couldn't understand. Whatever he said caused the tension to ease slightly, though the stares continued as they made their way to a large lodge at the center of the encampment. An elderly woman emerged, her face a map of deep lines that spoke of a life lived fully, under harsh conditions. She took in the situation with a glance, her eyes lingering on Ahote's pale face before shifting to Sarah with sharp assessment. "Grandmother," Keme said with reverence, "we have brought Ahote home. This woman saved him from death and brought him to us, despite danger to herself." The old woman approached Sarah's horse, looking up at her with eyes that seemed to contain the wisdom of centuries. "Come down," she said in surprisingly clear English. "You are tired and cold. There is food and fire." Sarah dismounted, her legs nearly buckling as they touched the ground. 3 days of tension and exertion had drained her more completely than she'd realized. The old woman took her arm with surprising strength, leading her toward the lodge. "I am a pony," she said. "Mother of Keme, grandmother to Ahote. Our people will honor what you have done." Inside the lodge, warmth enveloped Sarah like an embrace. A central fire cast dancing light across hide walls decorated with intricate designs, whose meanings she could only guess at. Several women were already tending to Ahote, unwrapping Sarah's bandages to examine his wound with expressions of approval. A pony guided Sarah to a place by the fire, pressing a wooden cup of something hot and fragrant into her hands. "Drink," she instructed. "It will warm your spirit." The liquid tasted of unfamiliar herbs, slightly bitter but not unpleasant. Heat spread through Sarah's limbs as she drank, easing the ache of overworked muscles and the persistent chill that had settled in her bones during the journey. "Thank you," she said, returning the empty cup. A pony nodded, settling beside her with the fluid grace of someone long accustomed to sitting on the ground. "Now tell me how you found my grandson," she said. "Tell me everything." Sarah began hesitantly, unsure how much detail to provide, but a pony's attentive expression encouraged her to speak freely. She described finding a hote in the snow, treating his wound, hiding him during the storm, and their escape from the approaching soldiers. As she spoke, others gathered to listen. Women pausing in their work, warriors returning from securing the horses, children creeping closer until gently shooed away. When she finished, a pony was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. Finally, she looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes with an intensity that seemed to reach into her soul. "Many winters ago," the old woman said, "I lost a daughter to the sickness brought by white settlers. My son lost his wife to the soldiers. My grandson lost his father in a raid. We have many reasons to turn away from your people, to see only enemies where humans stand." She reached out weathered hands to clasp Sarah's. "But the Creator has shown us through your actions that compassion does not recognize the boundaries. Men create. You saw only a person in need, not an enemy to fear." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She had not cried since James's funeral, had not allowed herself the luxury of emotion in the hard years that followed. Now, surrounded by strangers who were somehow no longer strange, the walls she had built began to crumble. "I did what anyone should have done," she repeated her earlier words, though they sounded hollow even to her own ears. How many of her neighbors would have made the same choice? "Not anyone," a pony said with gentle correction. You chose the difficult path when the easy one lay before you. For this, you have earned a place in our stories." The old woman rose, announcing something in Kiowa that caused a flurry of activity. Women brought food, strips of dried meat, cakes made from ground seeds and berries, more of the fragrant tea. Others prepared a sleeping place for Sarah near the fire, arranging soft furs into a pallet that looked more inviting than her own rough bed back at the cabin. As she ate, Sarah noticed a hote watching her from across the lodge. His wound had been redressed, and color had returned to his face. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could express. Recognition, gratitude, understanding. That night, as Sarah lay wrapped in unfamiliar furs in the heart of what should have been enemy territory, she realized something fundamental had shifted within her. The boundaries that had defined her world, settler and native, safe and dangerous, known and unknown, had been redrawn. And in their new configuration, she had somehow found a space where she could breathe more freely than she had in years. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath their cold light. In the hills, surrounding the camp, the soldiers who had been tracking a hote made their night camp, unaware of how close they had come to their quarry. And back at Sarah's cabin, the 3 army scouts returned, finding the property deserted, mysterious tracks leading away into the wilderness. The stage was set for a confrontation none of them could predict, forces moving toward each other like storm fronts gathering on the horizon. But for this night at least, there was peace in the Kiowa camp. An uneasy peace, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. And for Sarah Collingwood, there was the strange comfort of knowing that for the first time since her husband's death, she was not facing the darkness alone. Dawn broke with the muted colors of winter, pale lavender giving way to cold blue as the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. Sarah woke, disoriented, the unfamiliar sounds and scents of the lodge momentarily confusing. Her until memory rushed back. The events of the previous days unfolded in her mind as she lay still, listening to the quiet movements of others already awake around her. Women moved with practiced efficiency, banking fires, preparing morning meals, speaking in low tones that created a gentle backdrop of sound. Sarah sat up, folding the furs that had kept her warm through the night. A pony approached, offering a wooden bowl containing a thick porridge sprinkled with dried berries. "Eat," the older woman said. "The day brings decisions that require strength." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, realizing how hungry she was after the previous day's exertions. As she ate, she noticed a hote seated near the lodge entrance, deep in conversation with Kame and two other men she didn't recognize. Their expressions were grave, hands occasionally gesturing toward the hills beyond the camp. A pony followed her gaze. "They discuss the soldiers," she explained, settling beside Sarah. "3 patrols search for a hote, believing him responsible for an attack on a supply wagon at Fort Richardson." "Was he?" Sarah asked before she could stop herself. A pony's face remained impassive. "My grandson was hunting elk with his brothers when the attack occurred. The army sees all Kiowa as one enemy, not as individuals with different paths." Sarah nodded, understanding the truth in those words. To most settlers, native tribes existed as a monolithic threat rather than communities of distinct people with their own internal complexities and divisions. She had been guilty of the same simplistic thinking before finding a hote in the snow. "What will happen now?" she asked, setting aside her empty bowl. "The council meets this morning to decide," a pony said. "The younger warriors wish to move the camp deeper into the hills, where soldiers cannot easily follow. The elders counsel patience, believing the army will not risk open conflict during winter." "And what do you think?" A small smile touched the older woman's lips. "I think the presence of a white woman in our camp complicates matters in ways none foresaw." She studied Sarah's face. "You wish to return to your home?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "I have animals that need tending, and if I stay away too long, people will come looking." "People who would not understand finding you here," a pony concluded. Before Sarah could respond, the lodge flap opened fully, and a young boy of perhaps 10 years rushed in, speaking rapidly in Kiowa. The effect was immediate. The men by the entrance rose, Kim issuing swift instructions that sent the boy running back outside. Women began gathering children, moving them toward the rear of the lodge. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, standing. "Riders approaching from the south," a pony said, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the sudden activity around them. 8, perhaps 10, soldiers." Sarah's heart lurched. "Because of me? Have they followed my trail?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps they search all Kiowa camps in this region." A pony took Sarah's arm. "Come, you must not be seen if they enter the camp." She led Sarah to the back of the lodge, where a small opening had been created in the hide wall. Beyond was a narrow space between their lodge and the next, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. "If soldiers come, go through here and into the lodge beyond," a pony instructed. "My sister will hide you among the winter stores. Do not emerge until I come for you." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. If soldiers found her here, they would assume she had been taken captive, her protestations to the contrary likely falling on deaf ears. Violence would inevitably follow. A pony squeezed her arm once, then returned to the center of the lodge, her posture betraying none of the tension Sarah knew she must feel. Through the partly open entrance flap, Sarah could see increased activity in the camp. Women gathering children inside, men positioning themselves casually but strategically throughout the encampment. A hote appeared at her side, moving with Greater ease than the day before, though, still favoring his wounded side. "Stay within," he said quietly, "whatever happens." "This is my fault," Sarah whispered. "If they've tracked me here—" "You saved my life," he interrupted. "Now let me protect yours." His dark eyes held hers for a moment, communicating something. Beyond words, a connection forged in crisis, strengthened by shared risk. A call went up from the perimeter of the camp. Ahote touched her shoulder briefly, then moved away to join the men gathering near the entrance. Sarah stepped back into shadow, positioning herself near the escape route Aponi had shown her, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the lodge opening, she could see riders appearing at the edge of the camp, blue uniforms stark against the snow, rifles held ready but not aimed. An officer led them, his bearing suggesting authority and purpose. Keme and 3 other elders moved forward to meet them, their stance peaceful but watchful. Though too distant to hear the exchange clearly, Sarah could see the officer dismount, speaking to Keme with clipped gestures. The Kiowa elder's response was measured, his hands open to indicate transparency. The officer nodded, then signaled to his men. 4 dismounted, following him into the camp, while the others remained with the horses, their attention fixed on the Kiowa men who stood throughout the encampment. Sarah's breath caught as she realized the soldiers were conducting a search, moving methodically from lodge to lodge. They were looking for something, or someone. Her gaze found Ahote, now standing with 2 other warriors near a small storage structure. Though his posture appeared relaxed, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself to conceal his injury. The soldiers approached the central lodge, Aponi's lodge, where Sarah now stood frozen in indecision. Should she flee through the back as instructed, or would the movement draw unwanted attention? Before she could decide, the officer and 2 soldiers pushed aside the entrance flap and stepped inside. The interior seemed suddenly smaller, the soldiers' bulky winter uniforms and weaponry invasive in the intimate space. Sarah pressed herself deeper into shadow, grateful for the lodge's dim interior after the bright, snow-reflected light outside. "Captain Miller," Aponi greeted the officer in English, her voice betraying nothing of the tension Sarah knew she must feel. "What brings you to our camp on this cold morning?" The officer, Miller, removed his hat, revealing a face younger than Sarah had expected, though his eyes held the hardness of a man accustomed to command. "We're tracking insurgents responsible for attacking a supply wagon 3 days ago," he said without preamble. "One was wounded. We have reason to believe he sought shelter with your band." Aponi spread her hands. "As you can see, we are simply preparing for the winter hunt. No strangers have come to our fire." Miller's gaze swept the lodge interior, passing over Sarah's position without lingering. "We found tracks leading north from a settler's homestead," he continued. "A woman living alone. Her property was abandoned, signs of hasty departure. The tracks led in this direction." Sarah's heart seemed to stop. They had found her cabin empty, followed their trail. It was only a matter of time before they connected. "The pieces. Many paths cross the winter lands," Aponi observed. "The woman may have gone to town for supplies after the storm cleared." The captain's expression hardened. "Perhaps, or perhaps she was taken. There have been incidents before." One of the soldiers had been circling the lodge perimeter, examining its contents with obvious suspicion. He approached a pile of furs and provisions stacked against the wall, the very spot where Sarah had slept. Nudging them with his rifle barrel, he uncovered something that made him pause. "Captain," he called, "you should see this." Miller crossed to where the soldier stood, bending to examine whatever had caught his attention. When he straightened, he was holding Sarah's woolen scarf, the one she'd been wearing when they fled her cabin, the one she'd removed in the warmth of the lodge the night before. "This doesn't look like Kiowa handiwork," Miller observed, his voice dangerously quiet. The atmosphere in the lodge shifted palpably. Aponi remained composed, but Sarah could see the subtle tensing of her shoulders. Outside, a whistle sounded. A signal from the soldier still mounted at the camp's edge. Miller handed the scarf to his subordinate, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "I'll ask once more," he said to a pony. "Where is the settler woman, and where is the wounded Kiowa?" The moment stretched, taut with potential violence. Sarah made her decision in that breath, stepping forward from the shadows into the light. "I'm here, Captain," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "and I'm here by choice." Miller's head snapped toward her, shock evident in his expression, before he schooled it to professional neutrality. The soldiers beside him raised their rifles instinctively, only lowering them slightly at a gesture from their commander. "Mrs. Collingwood?" Miller asked, recognition dawning. "Sarah Collingwood from Willow Creek?" She nodded, surprised he knew her name, but realizing the soldiers must have identified her property during their search. "Yes. You're unharmed." I scanned her for signs of injury or distress. "Completely," she confirmed. "These people have shown me nothing but hospitality." Miller's expression shifted to confusion, tinged with suspicion. "You left your property willingly to come here? Why?" Sarah carefully considered her next words, aware that lives might depend on how she answered. "I helped an injured man during the blizzard," she said. "When it cleared, we saw your patrol searching. He was afraid and She hesitated. "I believed he was innocent of whatever you were seeking him for. I helped him reach his people." The captain's face hardened. "You harbored a fugitive and aided his escape?" "I harbored a human being who was dying in the snow," Sarah corrected, finding strength in the simple truth of it. "I didn't ask his tribe or whether he was wanted by law. I saw someone who needed help, and I gave it." "The man you helped is wanted for attacking a military supply wagon," Miller said. "2 soldiers were killed." "He couldn't have done it," Sarah replied, certainty in her voice. "When I found him, he'd been wounded at least a day, maybe more. The bullet was still in him. He could barely move, let alone attack anyone." Miller studied her face, looking for deception. Finding none, his certainty seemed to waver slightly. "Where is he now?" Sarah hesitated, unwilling to expose Ahote directly. Before she could formulate a response, the lodge flap opened again, and Ahote himself entered. He moved with deliberate calm, his hands empty and visible, his dark eyes meeting Miller's blue. And without flinching, "I am here," he said simply. Miller's hand returned to his pistol, but he didn't draw it. "You're the one they call Ahote?" "Yes. You're wanted for attacking a military supply train near the South Fork 3 days before the storm." Ahote shook his head once. "I was hunting with my brothers north of the ridge when your soldiers shot me. Ask the woman. The bullet was in my side for more than a day when she found me." "It's true," Sarah confirmed. "The wound was already festering. It couldn't have been fresh." Miller looked between them, doubt creeping into his expression. "If not you, then who?" "Comanche, perhaps," Ahote suggested. "Or renegades from the reservation. Not all who attack wear the same face, just as not all who wear blue act with honor." The subtle rebuke wasn't lost on Miller, whose jaw tightened. Momentarily, but something in the Kiowa's steady gaze seemed to reach him. He turned to the soldiers beside him. "Wait outside," he ordered. When they had gone, Miller addressed a pony. "Elder, I would speak with your counsel. Something doesn't align with the reports we received." A pony nodded, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "The council will hear you, but weapons remain outside our circle." Miller agreed with a short nod, then turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Collingwood, your actions, however well-intentioned, have complicated matters considerably. Whatever happens here today, you will need to return with us to explain yourself to the territorial authorities." "I understand," Sarah said, though dread pooled in her stomach at the thought of facing official questioning, and worse, the judgment of her neighbors once the story spread. A pony touched her arm gently. Go with Ahote now. The council will convene shortly. Sarah followed Ahote from the lodge into the crisp morning air. Outside, tension hung palpable between the soldiers and Kiowa warriors, both groups maintaining careful distances. Hands never far from weapons. Children watched wide-eyed from lodge entrances. Women continued their work with deliberate normalcy that fooled no one. What will happen now? Sarah asked as they walked toward a smaller lodge near the stream. The council will listen, Ahote replied. The army man seems different. He questions rather than accuses. This is rare. Will it be enough? Ahote's expression remained stoic, but his eyes held concern. For me, perhaps. For you. He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Sarah understood the precariousness of her position, caught between worlds, trusted fully by neither. She had violated the unwritten code of frontier settlements by helping a native, by choosing compassion over fear. Some would consider it treason. I don't regret it, she said quietly. Helping you. Ahote stopped walking, turning to face her. For the first time since she'd found him in the snow, she saw his guard drop completely. What replaced it wasn't gratitude. It was something more complex, more equal. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. In my language, he said softly, there is a word for someone who walks between worlds without fear. Nashoba. It means wolf that sees far. Before Sarah could respond, a call went up from the center of the camp. The council was gathering. Ahote gestured for her to follow, his expression returning to its usual careful neutrality as they walked toward the large ceremonial lodge where elders were already assembling. The next hours passed in a blur of testimony and translation. Sarah recounted her story multiple times, finding Ahote, treating his wound, hiding him during the army's first search, helping him reach his people. Captain Miller described the attack on the supply wagon, the tracks they'd followed, the witnesses who'd claimed the attackers were Kiowa. Ahote and his hunting companions testified to their whereabouts during the attack, providing details of their camp, the elk they'd tracked, the moment when army scouts had fired upon them without warning or provocation. Elders questioned, warriors added context, and slowly a different understanding of events began to emerge. By mid-afternoon, even Miller seemed convinced that Ahote and his companions had not been involved in the attack. The timing, the nature of his wound, the multiple witnesses to his hunting party's location, all contradicted the initial reports that had triggered the manhunt. It appears, Miller finally acknowledged, addressing the full council, that there has been a significant misidentification. The territorial governor will need to be informed, and a new investigation opened into who actually conducted the raid. Keme, speaking for the council, inclined his head. The Kiowa have honored our treaties. We hunt only in the lands agreed upon, take only what we need. We seek no conflict with the army or settlers. Not all commanders share your perspective, Miller admitted, but I will report what I've learned here today. His gaze shifted to Sarah, who sat slightly apart from both groups, acutely aware of her unusual position. As for Mrs. Collingwood, while her intentions were admirable, she interfered with a military investigation. There will need to be a formal hearing. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. A formal hearing meant public scrutiny, testimony before officials who might have little sympathy for her choices. It meant facing her neighbors with the knowledge that she had helped someone they considered an enemy. The woman acted with honor, a pony stated, her voice carrying unexpected authority in the male-dominated council. She preserved a life that would have been wrongfully taken. Is this not what your own laws claim to protect? Justice for the innocent? Miller shifted uncomfortably. The legal complexities. There is no complexity in mercy, the old woman interrupted. Only in its absence. A murmur of agreement rippled through the Kiowa elders. Miller looked around the circle, recognizing the subtle shift in power dynamics. This was no longer an interrogation of suspects, but a negotiation between leaders. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "given the circumstances, a formal hearing isn't necessary. A written statement for the record would suffice, provided Mrs. Collingwood returns to her property and," he hesitated, "and maintains appropriate distance from unauthorized tribal gatherings in the future." The implied warning was clear: help us save face, and we'll help you avoid prosecution. Sarah nodded her understanding, relief mixing with a strange disappointment. She would return to her life, to her solitary cabin and daily routines, carrying memories no one in Willow Creek would understand or wish to hear. As the council dispersed, arrangements were made for Sarah's return. She would ride with a military escort the following morning, ensuring her safe passage and simultaneously making clear to any observers that she had been rescued, not voluntarily living among the Kiowa. The fiction would protect everyone involved, even as it erased the truth of what had transpired. That evening, an unexpected ceremony took place in the central lodge. The entire camp gathered, elders, warriors, women, children, forming a circle around the fire. Sarah was given a place of honor beside a pony, uncomfortable with the attention but sensing the importance of the ritual unfolding. Kemi spoke at length in Kiowa, his words unintelligible to Sarah, but their gravity evident in the faces of those listening. When he finished, a pony translated quietly. "He speaks of bridges between peoples," she explained, "of how a single act of compassion may begin to heal wounds generations old. He names you Nashoba, as Ahote suggested, wolf that sees. Fa." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, humbled by an honor she wasn't certain she deserved. "I only did what seemed right at the time." "The moment of choice is when character reveals itself," Aponi replied. "Many speak of kindness. Few offer it to those they have been taught to fear." As the ceremony continued, members of the tribe approached, Sarah one by one, each presenting a small gift, a beaded bracelet, a carved wooden figure, a pouch of special herbs, a small woven blanket. These weren't random objects, she realized, but items of personal significance, offered with words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning transcended language. Last came Ahote, now moving without the stiffness of pain, his wound healing cleanly. In his hands was a necklace, a leather cord from which hung a small carved medallion depicting a wolf with its face turned toward distant mountains. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the detail remarkable given the small size. "For Nashoba," he said simply, placing it in her hands, "to remember that some bridges once built cannot be unmade." Sarah's fingers closed around the gift, emotion tightening her throat. "I couldn't forget if I tried," she replied softly. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Sarah lay awake in Aponi's lodge, the weight of the medallion against her skin, both strange and comforting. Tomorrow she would return to Willow Creek, to a life that now seemed smaller somehow, more confined than she had perceived it before. She would tend her animals, mend her fences, exchange pleasantries with neighbors who would never know or understand the truth of her absence. But something essential had changed within her. A widening of vision, a recognition that the boundaries she had accepted as fixed were in fact permeable, constructed from fear rather than truth. She had crossed those boundaries and found not enemies, but people with their own stories, their own sorrows and joys, their own complex humanity. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last thoughts were of Ahote standing in the snow, wounded but dignified, and of the choice she had made in that moment, a choice that had led her not only to this place, but to a new understanding of herself and the world she inhabited. Whatever came next, she would face it carrying that knowledge like a torch in darkness. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow bearing witness to the small miracles that occasionally bridged the chasms between hearts. In the hills beyond the camp, an owl called once, its voice carrying through the crystal air, not a harbinger of doom as settler superstition would have it, but a guardian of the night, watching over those who dared to see beyond the boundaries of their own making. The journey back to Willow Creek began at dawn, with frost glittering across the landscape and breath-forming clouds in the still air. Captain Miller and 4 of his men would escort Sarah, a formation that suggested protection, but felt uncomfortably like supervision. As they prepared to depart, the Kiowa gathered to witness her leaving, not with ceremony now, but with quiet acknowledgement of bonds formed in adversity. A pony embraced Sarah, her weathered hands warm against the younger woman's back. "Remember," she said softly, "though paths diverge, they may cross again when the season turns." Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. The old woman had become a touchstone during her brief time with the tribe, a source of wisdom and unexpected kinship that transcended the differences between their worlds. Keme approached next, offering a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "For your journey and beyond," he said, his English carefully measured. "Medicines, food, small tokens to remember our gratitude." Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate gravity. "Thank you for your hospitality and understanding. I won't forget what I've learned here." The elder smiled slightly. "Learning flows both ways, like water between banks. Your presence has taught us also." She looked past him, scanning the gathered faces for the one she hadn't yet seen this morning. Ahote stood apart from the others, near the edge of the clearing, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Their eyes met across the distance, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition without resolution, connection without conclusion. Captain Miller cleared his throat. "Mrs. Collingwood, we should be on our way if we're to reach your property before nightfall." Sarah nodded, turning toward the horse they had provided, not her own draft animal which remained with the Kiowa, but a sturdy bay mare with an army saddle. As she mounted, Ahote finally approached, his movement fluid now that his wound had begun to heal properly. "Safe journey, Nashoba," he said quietly, using the name they had given her. She touched the wolf medallion that hung beneath her collar, hidden from the soldier's view, but a tangible reminder of everything that had transpired, and to you when you travel. He nodded once, then stepped back, rejoining his people as Sarah turned her horse to follow Captain Miller's lead. They rode out in formation, 2 soldiers ahead, Sarah and the captain in the middle, 2 more bringing up the rear. As they crested the ridge that would take them out of sight of the camp, Sarah glanced back one final time, committing to memory the scene below. The clustered lodges, the morning fires sending tendrils of smoke into the clear air. The people continuing their daily tasks beneath the watchful mountains. Then they descended into the valley beyond, and the Kiowa winter camp vanished from view. The journey proceeded in relative silence for the first few hours. The soldiers maintained a professional distance, looking past Sarah rather than at her, as if uncertain how to categorize a white woman who had willingly lived among natives. Captain Miller rode beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering neutral observations about the weather, carefully avoiding any substantive discussion of what had occurred. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses and take a sparse meal of hardtack and dried beef. Sarah sat slightly apart from the soldiers, unwrapping a portion of the food Kem had provided. Pemmican, much more flavorful than the army rations, and dried berries that brought welcome sweetness to her palate. Miller settled nearby, watching her with barely disguised curiosity. "That's native food," he finally observed. Sarah nodded. "Yes, practical for travel. Keeps well, provides strength." "You seem comfortable with their ways." She met his gaze directly. "I found them to be people of dignity and principle, Captain. Not so different from anyone else in their basic needs and desires." Miller considered this, breaking a piece of hardtack with more force than necessary. Most settlers wouldn't share that perspective. "Most settlers haven't shared their fire," Sarah replied simply. A brief smile touched the captain's face, gone almost before she registered it. "No, I suppose they haven't." He hesitated, then added, "What you did, helping the Kiowa man, I mean, it was dangerous, foolish, some would say." "Some would," she agreed, "but brave," he concluded, surprising her. "Misguided, perhaps, given what could have happened, but brave nonetheless." Sarah studied him more carefully, seeing beyond the uniform to the man beneath. Younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of sun and wind rather than age. A frontier officer, not an East Coast military man, someone who understood the complexities of the territories better than most. "You didn't believe he was guilty from the beginning, did you?" she asked, intuition guiding her words. Miller glanced toward his men, ensuring they were out of earshot. "The report never sat right with me," he admitted quietly. "The witnesses were unreliable, trappers with grudges against natives. The description of the attackers changed with each telling. But orders are orders, and in these territories accusations against tribes are taken at face value. Yet you listened to their counsel. You were willing to be convinced." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her assessment. "I'm a soldier, Mrs. Collingwood, not a crusader. I follow my orders, but I try to execute them with as much fairness as circumstances allow." She nodded, understanding the careful line he walked. "What will happen now to Ahote and his people?" "Nothing, if I have any say in the matter. My report will state that the attackers were incorrectly identified, that further investigation is warranted. Whether anyone higher up the chain of command cares to pursue that investigation..." He left the thought unfinished. "And me?" she pressed. "What will your report say about me?" Miller met her eyes directly. "That you were temporarily displaced by the storm, received assistance from local natives, and were escorted back to your property once conditions allowed. Nothing more." Relief washed through her. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," he cautioned. "The army may not pursue this further, but your neighbors might have questions about your absence. People talk, Mrs. Collingwood, especially in isolated communities." Sarah nodded, already aware of the challenges that awaited her in Willow Creek. She had violated the unspoken rules of frontier settlements, the maintenance of clear boundaries, the adherence to collective fears and prejudices. Even if no official censure came, unofficial judgment certainly would. They resumed their journey after the brief rest, the terrain gradually transitioning from rugged foothills to the more familiar rolling plains that surrounded Willow Creek. By late afternoon, Sarah recognized landmarks that indicated they were approaching her property: the lightning-struck oak that marked the northern boundary, the small creek that wound through her pasture, the gentle rise where her cabin stood. As they crested that final hill, the scene below made her breath catch. Her cabin appeared intact, but activity surrounded it, horses tethered to the rail, figures moving in and out of the barn, smoke rising from the chimney though she had banked the fire. Before leaving, "Neighbors," Miller observed, his tone neutral but his expression watchful. "Appears they've been looking after your livestock." Sarah wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or apprehensive. In frontier communities, neighbors helped neighbors as a matter of survival, but their presence now complicated her return story. What had they observed? What conclusions had they drawn? Miller signaled his men to proceed with caution, the formation tightening slightly around Sarah as they descended toward the cabin. The figures below noticed their approach, pausing in their tasks to watch the riders coming down the hill. Sarah recognized Thomas Jenkins, whose property adjoined hers to the south, and the Alderman brothers, who ran the general store in town. Several other men she knew only by sight stood near the barn. As they reached the yard, Jenkins stepped forward, his weathered face a mask of concern that shifted to surprise when he recognized Sarah among the soldiers. "Mrs. Collingwood," he exclaimed, "thank the Lord you're safe. We feared the worst when we found your place abandoned." Sarah dismounted, feeling the weight of all eyes upon her. "As you can see, Mr. Jenkins, I'm quite well. Thank you for tending to my animals while I was gone. Where were you?" This from Elias Alderman, his tone more accusatory than concerned. "Your horse and sled were missing, fire cold, no note left. In the middle of winter, after that terrible storm. Didn't seem right." Before Sarah could formulate a response, Captain Miller intervened, his official manner creating an immediate shift in the gathering's dynamics. "Mrs. Collingwood was caught away from her property when the blizzard worsened," he stated, the authority in his voice brooking no argument. "She sought shelter until conditions improved, then was escorted home by my patrol. A sensible decision that likely saved her life, given the severity of the storm." The explanation, deliberately vague but plausible, seemed to satisfy most of the men present. Jenkins nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Well, we're just glad to see you back safe and sound," he said. "Ellen's been beside herself with worry. Wanted to come check on you herself, but I wouldn't let her make the trip in this cold." "Please thank her for her concern," Sarah replied, genuine gratitude in her voice. Ellen Jenkins had been kind to her after James's death, one of the few neighbors who continued to visit regularly. Captain Miller dismounted, addressing the gathered men. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your diligence in looking after Mrs. Collingwood's property. Now that she's safely returned, I trust you'll help her get settled before you depart." It was not a request. The neighbors murmured agreement, though Alderman continued to regard Sarah with barely disguised suspicion. The soldiers remained mounted, their presence a clear message that the army considered the matter closed and expected the community to do likewise. The neighbors departed within the hour, having ensured Sarah's animals were properly tended and her firewood restocked. Jenkins was the last to leave, lingering by the door with evident concern. "You know how people talk, Sarah," he said quietly, using her given name as a sign of genuine worry rather than impropriety. "There's been rumors, tracks leading from your place to Kiowa territory, your horse found wandering near Blackwater Creek. Miller's explanation will satisfy most, but Alderman, he's always been suspicious of anything that doesn't fit his narrow view of proper behavior." Sarah nodded, appreciating his candor. "I understand, Thomas. I can handle Elias and his opinions. Ellen would like to visit tomorrow if that's agreeable. Bring some of her preserves and catch up." The offer touched Sarah, a simple gesture of community that suddenly seemed precious after her time away. "I'd like that very much." As Jenkins rode off, Captain Miller approached for a final word before departing with his men. "The official report will be filed at Fort Richardson next week," he informed her. "As discussed, it will contain only the basics of your temporary displacement due to weather. However," he hesitated, glancing toward his men, who waited at a discreet distance. "However," Sarah prompted, "I would advise discretion regarding your actual experiences," he said carefully. "Frontier settlements can be unforgiving of those who cross certain boundaries, regardless of circumstances or intentions." She understood his warning all too well. "I appreciate your concern, Captain, and your understanding in this matter." He nodded once, military formality reasserting itself as he rejoined his men. With brief salutes, the soldiers departed, hoofbeats fading into the gathering dusk as they rode toward Fort Richardson. Sarah stood alone in her yard, the sudden silence enveloping her like a physical presence. After days surrounded by the sounds of the Kiowa camp, children's laughter, women's work songs, the rhythmic percussion of daily activities, the isolation of her homestead felt both familiar and strangely hollow. She moved through her evening routine with mechanical efficiency, building up the fire, preparing a simple meal, checking that the neighbors had indeed cared for her animals properly. Everything was as she had left it, yet somehow transformed by her absence, as if she were seeing her own life through different eyes. That night, Sarah sat by the fire long after she would normally have retired, Keme's bundle open before her. Among the practical items, medicines, dried food, a small knife of exceptional craftsmanship, she found unexpected treasures. A pair of moccasins beautifully beaded with geometric designs, a small pouch of special tobacco that a pony had said would help with dreams, and a folded piece of bark upon which was painted a stylized wolf looking toward distant mountains. The same image as the medallion Ahote had given her. She touched each item reverently, these tangible connections, to an experience that already felt dreamlike in its intensity and brevity. The moccasins fit perfectly when she tried them on, soft against her feet after the rigid practical boots she typically wore. The wolf painting she placed on the mantel, where firelight made the simple image seem almost alive in its fluid lines. Sleep came fitfully that night, her body accustomed to the sounds and rhythms of the lodge rather than the creaking solitude of her cabin. When she did sleep, her dreams were vivid. Snow falling like memory, dark eyes watching from shadows, a wolf running free across boundless plains. She woke before dawn, the medallion warm against her skin where she had worn it to bed. A talisman against forgetting. The following days established a new pattern, outwardly identical to her life before finding Ahote, yet inwardly transformed by everything she had experienced. She tended her animals, repaired storm damage to the cabin roof, received Ellen Jenkins's visit with appropriate gratitude for the preserves and concern shown. To all outward appearances, Sarah Collingwood had simply resumed her solitary existence. After an unexpected adventure, but in quiet moments, when no one observed her, change revealed itself in small ways. The moccasins she wore inside her cabin, the herbs from a pony she added to her tea, the words in Kiowa she practiced under, her breath while working. She found herself listening differently to neighbors' casual comments about those Indians, hearing the fear beneath the bravado, recognizing the ignorance that shaped their opinions. A week after her return, Sarah rode into Willow Creek for supplies. The small town consisted of little more than a general store, a smithy, a saloon that doubled as a hotel for infrequent travelers, and a handful of other businesses catering to the surrounding homesteads. As she tied her horse outside Alderman's general store, she felt the weight of curious gazes through windows and from the boardwalk. Inside, conversation stuttered to silence as the bell above the door announced her entrance. Elias Alderman stood behind the counter, his thin face unwelcoming as she approached with her list of needed items. "Mrs. Collingwood," he acknowledged stiffly. "What can I get for you today?" Sarah handed him the list, maintaining the polite composure that had been her armor since James's death. "Just the usual supplies, Mr. Alderman, and perhaps some coffee if you've received a shipment." He scanned the list with exaggerated care. "Flour, sugar, salt? Seems you're stocking up more than usual." "Winter's far from over," she replied evenly. "Best to be prepared, given the unpredictability of the weather." Alderman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, storms can drive a person to make all sorts of unusual decisions." The implication hung in the air between them. From the corner where several local women sorted through fabric bolts, whispers carried just loudly enough to be intentionally overheard. "Living with savages." Wouldn't put it past her, always was strange after her husband died. But Captain Miller's story seemed convenient. Sarah ignored the whispers, meeting Alderman's gaze with steady determination. "I'll need those supplies today, Mr. Alderman. I'm happy to pay in coin rather than trade, if that's your preference." The mention of cash payment, always at a premium in frontier economies, shifted his expression marginally. Business, after all, remained business. He began gathering her requested items, though his movements communicated disapproval with every deliberate motion. As Sarah waited, Ellen Jenkins entered the store, her round face brightening at the sight of her neighbor. Unlike the others, Ellen approached directly, genuine warmth in her greeting. "Sarah, wonderful to see you in town. How are you settling back in?" Before Sarah could respond, Alderman interjected from behind the counter. "She seems to be stocking up quite extensively, almost as if she's preparing for another absence." Ellen's brow furrowed slightly, but she rallied quickly. "Well, after that terrible storm, I think we're all being more cautious with our supplies. Thomas has doubled our usual order of kerosene and salt, just to be safe." Her casual defense, offered without drama but with clear intent, eased some of the tension in the room. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude for this simple act of neighborly support. "How is Thomas?" she asked, steering the conversation toward safer ground. "His knee seemed to be bothering him when he visited last week." They chatted about inconsequential matters as Alderman completed Sarah's order, the normalcy of their exchange, gradually drawing the store back to its usual rhythm. When Sarah paid and gathered her supplies, Ellen insisted on helping her load them into her saddlebags. Outside, away from prying ears, Ellen's expression grew serious. "People are talking, Sarah. Nonsense mostly, but persistent. The aldermans particularly seemed determined to question the army's account of where you were during the storm." Sarah secured a bag of flour with practiced movements. "People always talk. Ellen, it will pass once something more interesting captures their attention." "Perhaps," Ellen conceded. "But in the meantime, well, just know that not everyone shares their suspicions. Thomas and I believe Captain Miller's explanation completely." The deliberate emphasis made it clear that Ellen was offering more than simple reassurance. She was providing Sarah with a choice. Accept the official story publicly, and Ellen would support it without question. Offer a different truth, and Ellen would listen without judgment. For a moment, Sarah was tempted to share everything. Finding a hote in the snow, the days in the Kiowa camp, the ceremony where they had given her a new name. The weight of carrying these experiences alone suddenly felt overwhelming in the face of Ellen's genuine concern. Instead, she touched her friend's hand briefly. "Thank you, Ellen. Your friendship means more than I can say." Understanding passed. Between them, some truths were best kept private, at least for now. Ellen nodded, helping Sarah mount her horse. "Come for dinner next Sunday," she invited. "Thomas would enjoy the company, and I've been experimenting with a new apple preserve recipe." Sarah accepted with genuine pleasure, the simple normalcy of the invitation a bridge back to the life she had temporarily left behind. As she rode out of town, she felt the medallion against her skin beneath her collar, a reminder that some bridges extended in the opposite direction as well, connecting her to experiences beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek's understanding. The plains stretched before her, winter-brown but touched with the first hints of approaching spring. In the distance, the hills rose toward mountains still snow-capped and remote. Somewhere beyond those peaks, the Kiowa were preparing for their seasonal migration, following ancient patterns as the earth awakened from winter's grip. Sarah turned, her horse toward home, aware that she now inhabited a middle space, not fully belonging to either world, yet somehow connected to both. The knowledge settled within her, not as isolation this time, but as a unique perspective, a widened horizon that few were privileged to glimpse. Nashoba, wolf that sees far. The name they had given her seemed more fitting with each passing day, as she navigated the complexities of her return with new eyes that recognized fear disguised as certainty, judgment masked as concern. She rode tall in the saddle, the winter sun warm on her face despite the lingering chill in the air. A woman transformed not by dramatic events alone, but by the quiet revolution of seeing beyond the boundaries others accepted as immutable. Truth. Spring arrived on the Kansas plains with characteristic unpredictability. Warm days that coaxed green shoots from the soil, followed by bitter frost that threatened tender growth. The cycle of thaw and freeze mirrored Sarah's own experience in Willow Creek since her return. Some days brought moments of warmth, of casual interaction that suggested her place in the community remained secure. Other days brought frost in the form of whispers that ceased when she entered the general store, or the pointed way Reverend Stillwell had asked after her spiritual welfare when she ventured into town for Sunday services. Through it all, Sarah maintained a dignified composure, neither confirming rumors nor offering explanations beyond Captain Miller's official account. She worked her land with the same determination she had always shown, preparing fields for planting, mending fences damaged by winter storms, welcoming the arrival of 3 new calves and a skittish foal born to her mare. The rhythm of farm life provided structure, but in the quiet hours, evenings beside the fire, early mornings when dawn painted the plains in lavender and gold, her thoughts often drifted to the Kiowa camp and the people who had welcomed her there. She wondered where they had traveled as spring advanced, whether Ahoti's wound had healed completely, if a pony's hands still shaped medicine with ancient wisdom. The wolf medallion remained her constant companion, hidden beneath her clothing, but warm against her skin, a tangible reminder that her experience had been real, not simply a dream born of isolation. 6 weeks after her return, as April coaxed wildflowers from the prairie soil, Sarah rode to the Jenkins farm for Sunday dinner. These weekly gatherings had become a welcome respite from her solitude, Ellen's warm friendship and Thomas's practical good humor offering connection without expectation. The Jenkins homestead was larger than Sarah's, a 2-story farmhouse, with a generous porch, substantial barn, and well-tended fields that stretched toward the horizon. Thomas had arrived in the territory with capital from family back east, unlike James, who had relied solely on his own labor to build their more modest holding. The difference showed in 100 small ways, from the matched team of horses in the barn to the glass windows that caught the afternoon light. Ellen greeted Sarah with a warm embrace, taking her shawl and leading her into a kitchen fragrant with roasting chicken and fresh-baked bread. Thomas joined them from the barn, his weathered face creasing in a genuine smile as he clasped Sarah's hand. "Just in time," he announced. "I've built up an appetite that could rival a bear after hibernation." Ellen laughed, shooing him toward the wash basin. "Clean up first, or you'll be dining in the barn with the livestock." Their easy affection was a balm to Sarah's spirit. Here, at least, she found no frost of suspicion, only the warmth of friendship that asked nothing beyond her. Company. They settled around the dining table, a handsome piece Thomas had commissioned from the carpenter in town, and Ellen served the meal with evident pride in her culinary accomplishments. As they ate, conversation flowed naturally, touching, on practical matters of farming, local news, and plans for the season ahead. It wasn't until they were enjoying apple pie with cream that Thomas's expression grew more serious. "Had an interesting visitor yesterday," he said, setting down his fork. "Captain Miller, passing through on his way back to Fort Richardson." Sarah's hand stilled momentarily before she forced herself to continue eating normally. "Oh?" Thomas nodded. "Stopped to water his horse. Ended up staying for coffee. Seemed particularly interested in how you were faring since your return." "That was considerate of him," Sarah replied carefully. "I thought so too," Thomas agreed, "especially given what he shared about the circumstances of finding you." Sarah set her fork down, meeting Thomas's direct gaze. And what did he share exactly? Ellen reached over to touch her husband's arm. Thomas. He covered his wife's hand with his own. It's all right, Ellen. I think Sarah deserves to know that not everyone believes Alderman's poisonous gossip. He turned back to Sarah. Miller told me the truth, that you helped a wounded Kiowa during the blizzard, that you accompanied him to his people when you realized he was being hunted for something he didn't do. Sarah felt a mixture of alarm and relief wash through her. Miller had promised discretion in his official report, but it seemed he had made a judgment call about whom to trust with the fuller story. He didn't mention it to anyone else in town, Thomas assured her, reading her expression. Just to me, and only because he wanted someone local to keep an eye out for you. Said you showed rare courage, and that some folks might not understand the context of your choices. They wouldn't, Sarah confirmed quietly. Most people here see only enemies when they think of the Kiowa. Ellen squeezed her hand. Not everyone, Sarah. Some of us understand that people are just people, regardless of where they come from, or what language they speak. The simple assertion, delivered without drama, but with absolute conviction, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. She had been carrying the weight of her secret alone for so long that sharing it, even in this limited way, felt like setting down a heavy burden she hadn't fully acknowledged. Thank you, she managed, blinking back moisture. Both of you. Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest. Miller also mentioned something else, that the Kiowa seemed to hold you in high regard. Said they gave you gifts, performed some kind of ceremony before you left. Sarah hesitated, then reached beneath her collar to withdraw the wolf medallion, laying it on the table where the afternoon light caught its polished surface. They called me Nashoba, she said softly. It means wolf that sees far. Ellen gasped softly, reaching out a finger to trace the carved image. It's beautiful, she murmured. And they gave you a name. That's significant, isn't it? Very, Sarah confirmed. Names have power in their culture. To be given one is to be acknowledged as belonging in some way. The moment stretched. Between them, fragile and profound. Then Thomas cleared his throat, his practical nature reasserting itself. Well, that settles it, he declared. If the Kiowa consider you one of their own, and we consider you one of ours, then I'd say you're in a unique position to bridge some mighty wide gaps. Sarah smiled at his simplification of a complex reality, but appreciated the sentiment behind. Deal. I'm not sure everyone would see it that way. No, he agreed. But times are changing, Sarah. The war's been over for more than a decade. The government's talking about new approaches to tribal relations. Captain Miller strikes me as a different kind of officer than some we've seen out here, one who values truth over expedience. Ellen began gathering the empty plates. What Thomas is trying to say, in his roundabout way, is that you're not alone in believing there might be better paths forward than endless conflict. The following week brought the first real heat of late spring, the kind that hinted at summer's intensity to come. Sarah worked in her small garden, planting the seedlings she had nurtured indoors during the final weeks of winter. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating neat rows where beans would climb and squash would sprawl as the season progressed. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't immediately notice the rider approaching from the east. Only when the horse's shadow fell across her garden did she look up, shielding her eyes against the bright sunlight. Captain Miller sat astride his mount, military posture somewhat relaxed, hat in hand rather than on his head. Mrs. Collingwood, he greeted her formally. I hope I'm not intruding on your work. Sarah stood, brushing soil from her hands. Captain Miller, this is unexpected. He dismounted, leading his horse toward the water trough near the barn. I'm conducting a patrol circuit of the outlying settlements. Thought I should check on how you're faring. There was something in his manner, a slight awkwardness beneath the military bearing, that suggested the patrol story might be a convenient. fiction rather than his primary purpose. Sarah indicated the porch. "I was about to take a break. Would you care for some coffee?" The captain nodded, securing his horse before following her to the cabin. He waited on the porch while she washed her hands and prepared the coffee inside, his gaze traveling across her property with evident assessment. When she emerged with 2 steaming cups, he accepted one with formal thanks. "Your place looks well kept," he observed. "You've accomplished a lot on your own." "Necessity is a thorough teacher," she replied, settling into one of the 2 rocking chairs that had been James's final project before his illness. "But I suspect you didn't ride all this way to comment on my farming skills, Captain." A smile briefly lightened his serious expression. "No, ma'am, I didn't." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "I wanted to inform you personally that the investigation into the supply wagon attack has concluded. The actual perpetrators were identified, a group of deserters operating in the Western Territories, not Kiowa or any other tribal members." Relief washed through Sarah. "So Ahote is officially cleared?" "Yes, all suspicion has been formally lifted." "Have you told them, his people, I mean?" Miller nodded. "A messenger was sent to their spring grounds near the Cimarron. The treaty administrator confirmed delivery of the news." Sarah felt tension she hadn't fully acknowledged begin to dissolve. Though she had believed in Ahote's innocence from the beginning, knowing it was now officially recognized brought unexpected comfort. "There's something else," Miller continued, setting his coffee cup aside. "The reason I wanted to speak with you directly." Sarah waited, sensing from his tone that whatever came next carried significance beyond a simple update on the investigation. "The territorial governor has appointed a new Indian agent for this region, a man named Harrison Wells. Miller seemed to search for the right words. "He's different from his predecessors. Actually lived among the Cherokee for several years as a young man, speaks several native languages, believes in finding common ground rather than simply enforcing compliance." "That sounds promising," Sarah observed cautiously. "It is," Miller agreed, "but he faces significant challenges. Decades of mistrust don't disappear overnight, even with the best intentions on both sides." He paused, studying her face. "Wells is looking for people who can help, individuals who have demonstrated the ability to see beyond fear and prejudice, who might serve as intermediaries in sensitive situations." Understanding dawned. "And you thought of me?" "I did," he confirmed. "Your experience with the Kiowa, the respect you earned from them. It's precisely the kind of bridge Wells is trying to build." Sarah felt a momentary vertigo, as if the solid ground of her daily existence had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "What exactly are you suggesting, Captain?" "An informal role, at least initially. Occasional consultation when Wells visits the region. Perhaps acting as a witness during treaty discussions to help ensure fair translation and treatment." Miller leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know it's an unusual proposition for a woman alone, especially given local attitudes. But I also know what I observed in that Kiowa camp. You have a gift for seeing people as they are, not as others. Have taught you to fear they might be." Sarah rose, moving to the porch railing where she could look out across her land. The fields she had planted, the animals she had tended, the life she had maintained through sheer determination after James's death. This place represented security, the known path, the life she had thought would be hers until age claimed her. Yet even as she recognized its value, she felt the tug of something else, a wider horizon, a purpose beyond mere survival, a chance to transform her unexpected journey with Ahote into something that might benefit others. "I would need to think about it," she said finally, turning back to face Miller. "My place here—" "Of course," he agreed quickly. "It wouldn't require abandoning your home. Just occasional travel, perhaps a few days at a time when needed." Sarah nodded, her mind already calculating the practical considerations: who could tend her animals during absences, how the community might react, what it would mean to step deliberately into a role that crossed boundaries most considered. Inviolable. "When does Agent Wells need an answer?" she asked. "He'll be at Fort Richardson in 3 weeks' time. I could convey your decision then, if you'd prefer not to meet him immediately." "I appreciate that," Sarah said, "and thank you, Captain, for bringing this to me directly." Miller stood, preparing to take his leave. "Thank you for considering it, Mrs. Collingwood. Whatever you decide, I believe your experience has value beyond what most would recognize." After he departed, Sarah remained on the porch, watching the sun's angle change as afternoon stretched toward evening. The medallion felt heavy against her skin, as if responding to the weight of the decision before her. To accept Wells's proposition would mean acknowledging publicly what she had thus far kept largely private: her connection to the Kiowa, her willingness to see beyond the boundaries that defined frontier life. Yet something in the idea resonated deep within her, as if completing a circle that had begun the moment she found a hote half buried in snow. Neshoba. Wolf that sees far. Perhaps this was what her Kiowa name had been preparing her for all along. The following Sunday, Sarah declined the Jenkins dinner invitation for the first time since her return, choosing instead to ride east along Blackwater Creek, where the land opened into rolling prairie dotted with early summer wildflowers. She needed solitude to think, space to consider the choice before her without the influence of others' expectations. Near midday, she stopped to rest her horse near a stand of cottonwoods that offered welcome shade. As she spread a small cloth for her lunch, movement at the edge of her vision caused her to turn sharply. A wolf stood watching her from perhaps 50 yards away, not the smaller coyote common to these parts, but a true wolf, silver-grey and substantial, its amber eyes fixed on her with intelligent assessment. Sarah remained absolutely still, bread half raised to her lips, scarcely breathing. Wolves were increasingly rare in these settled territories, driven north and west by advancing homesteads and hunters' rifles. To see one this close to Willow Creek was remarkable. The wolf maintained its position, neither approaching nor retreating, simply observing with unnerving intensity. Time stretched between them, human and predator engaged in silent communion, that felt significant beyond rational explanation. Then, with deliberate grace, the wolf turned and loped away across the prairie, disappearing into the tall grasses as if it had never been. Sarah released her breath slowly, her hand unconsciously, rising to touch the medallion beneath her dress. The encounter left her shaken, not with fear, but with a sense of witnessing something profound, a visitation that defied the neat categories of her previous understanding. That evening, as she sat by her fire recording the day's events in the journal she had begun keeping since her return, Sarah found herself drawing the wolf on the blank page, its watchful eyes, its powerful presence, the moment of connection that had transcended the usual boundaries between wild and domestic. Beneath the drawing, she wrote a single word: Neshoba. The decision crystallized within her, not through logical analysis, but through intuition sharpened by experience. She would accept Agent Wells's proposal, would step into the unfamiliar role of mediator between worlds that typically regarded each other with suspicion, if not outright hostility. The path would not be easy, would likely invite criticism from neighbors who already questioned her judgment, but it offered purpose beyond mere survival. Sarah closed her journal, setting it aside as she prepared for bed. Through the cabin window, stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her journey with Ahote, that now watched over Kiowa camps and army forts and scattered homesteads across the vast territory. Different people, different lives, all beneath the same infinite sky. The thought brought unexpected comfort as she drifted toward sleep. There were divisions aplenty on the earth below, lines drawn by fear and history, borders marked by bloodshed and misunderstanding. But from above, perhaps those boundaries appeared as arbitrary as they truly were, human constructions no more substantial than the imaginary lines connecting stars into constellations. In the morning, Sarah rose before dawn, completing her chores with efficient purpose before saddling her horse for the ride to Fort Richardson. Better to deliver her decision in person than wait for Miller's return. Better to meet this Agent Wells directly and assess for herself whether his intentions matched his reputation. As she rode east into the rising sun, the medallion warm against her skin, Sarah felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The woman who had once been defined primarily as James Collingwood's widow, who had existed at the margins of her community, neither fully embraced nor entirely rejected, was transforming into someone new, someone shaped not by others' expectations, but by her own choices and experiences. Neshoba, the name the Kiowa had given her, no longer felt foreign, but rather like a truth she had always known without naming. Wolf that sees far. In a territory divided by fear and misunderstanding, perhaps clear sight was the rarest gift of all, the ability to look beyond what others had decided was true and perceive what actually existed in the spaces between. The plains stretched before her, brown grasses giving way to green with the progression of spring, wildflowers adding bursts of color to the rolling landscape. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Ahote and his people continued their seasonal movements, following patterns established long before European settlers arrived with their fences and deeds and rigid conceptions of ownership. Two worlds, separate yet increasingly forced to interact. Sarah rode toward an uncertain future, aware that she now inhabited the borderland between those worlds, not fully belonging to either, yet connected to both in ways that might prove valuable in the days to come. It was an unfamiliar position, lonely in some respects, but offering a perspective few others could claim. As the sun climbed higher, casting her shadow long across the prairie, Sarah straightened in the saddle. The journey ahead would not be easy, but few worthwhile paths were. She had survived a Kansas winter alone, had found strength in solitude, had crossed boundaries others considered inviolable, and returned with expanded vision. Whatever challenges awaited at Fort Richardson and beyond, she would face them with the same quiet courage that had led her to carry a wounded stranger from the snow into the warmth of possibility. Behind her, Willow Creek and its familiar limitations receded. Before her, an uncertain future beckoned, and within her, the woman who had once defined herself primarily through loss continued her transformation into someone newly defined, by choice, by connection, by the willingness to see beyond boundaries others accepted as immutable truth. Neshoba, wolf that sees far. She rode toward the horizon, carrying her new name like a promise. Fort Richardson rose from the plains like an assertion of order against wilderness. Wooden palisades surrounding utilitarian buildings, the American flag, snapping in the breeze above the central parade ground. As Sarah approached the main gate, she felt the weight of eyes tracking her progress, soldiers on patrol, civilian workers pausing in their tasks, a group of native women washing laundry near the creek that ran along the fort's eastern edge. The guard at the entrance regarded her with mild surprise. Women rarely traveled alone to military outposts, especially those as remote as Fort Richardson. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but reserved. "I'm here to see Captain Miller," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nervousness, fluttering in her chest. "My name is Sarah Collingwood." Recognition flickered across the young soldier's face. "Yes, ma'am. The captain mentioned you might be visiting. Please wait here while I send someone to fetch him." She dismounted, grateful for the opportunity to stretch her legs after the long ride. The fort bustled with midday activity. Soldiers, Drilling on the parade ground, wagons delivering supplies, the blacksmith's hammer creating rhythmic punctuation to the ambient noise. It was a world unto itself, neither fully military nor completely civilian, existing in the borderlands between settled territories and the vast expanses still largely controlled by native tribes. Captain Miller appeared within minutes, his usual formal demeanor softened by evident surprise at her arrival. "Mrs. Collingwood," he greeted her, offering a slight bow. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "I decided a direct approach was best," she explained. "Is Agent Wells here yet?" Miller nodded, gesturing for her to follow as a young private took charge. "Of her horse. Arrived yesterday. He's meeting with tribal representatives this afternoon." He studied her face. "Does this mean you've reached a decision?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed simply. "I'd like to meet him at least, to understand exactly what he's proposing before making a final commitment." The captain led her toward the administrative building, a substantial structure at the fort's center. "He'll be pleased to meet you. He asked quite a few questions after I mentioned your experience with the Kiowa." Inside, the building offered welcome respite from the afternoon heat. Miller guided her to a small office where a man sat behind a desk covered with maps and documents, his attention focused on the papers before him. He looked up as they entered, rising immediately to his feet. Harrison Wells was not what Sarah had expected. Rather than the formal government official she had anticipated, she found herself facing a man of perhaps 50, with wind-weathered features and keen eyes that assessed her with undisguised interest. His clothing, while appropriate to his position, showed signs of hard travel, and his hands bore calluses that suggested he was no stranger to physical labor. "Agent Wells," Miller said, "may I present Mrs. Sarah Collingwood of Willow Creek?" Wells extended his hand, his grip firm when Sarah offered her own. "Mrs. Collingwood," he greeted her, his voice carrying the slight inflection of someone who had spent significant time in the Southern Territories. "Captain Miller has spoken highly of your insights regarding the Kiowa people." "My experience was limited," Sarah replied, taking the seat he offered. "Just a few days in their winter camp." "Yet you made an impression," Wells observed, returning to his chair. "Enough that they performed a naming ceremony and presented you with gifts of significance. That suggests a depth of connection many government representatives never achieve despite years of official interaction." Sarah felt a flush of surprise that he knew such specific details. Miller must have shared more than she had realized. "They showed me kindness when they had no reason to trust a stranger," she said simply. "I merely responded in kind." Wells smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "And therein lies precisely the quality that interests me, Mrs. Collingwood. The ability to see people as individuals rather than representatives of a group to be feared or controlled." He gestured toward the maps spread across his desk. "The government's approach to tribal relations is shifting, however slowly. There's growing recognition that the cycle of conflict benefits no one, not the tribes forced onto ever-shrinking territories, not the settlers facing constant fear, not the government expending resources on endless military campaigns. Yet mistrust runs deep on all sides," Sarah observed, "with good reason given the history." "Precisely," Wells agreed, "which is why we need individuals who can serve as bridges, people respected by both communities, who can help translate not just words but intentions, who can identify common ground where others see only division." Sarah considered his words, appreciating his directness. "And you believe I could serve in such a capacity?" "Captain Miller seems to think so," Wells replied, "and my experience suggests that individuals who have crossed cultural boundaries successfully once are often capable of doing so again. The Kiowa gave you a name that recognizes vision, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances. That aligns with what we need. Captain Miller, who had remained standing near the door, finally spoke. I should mention that the position would come with modest compensation, Mrs. Collingwood. The government doesn't expect service without recompense. The practical consideration hadn't occurred to Sarah, focused as she had been on the larger implications of accepting such a role. The idea of payment, of her unusual experience being valued in tangible terms, added another dimension to her decision. What exactly would my responsibilities entail? She asked, directing the question to Wells. He leaned forward, his manner becoming more businesslike. Initially acting as an observer during negotiations, providing insights into Kiowa customs and perspectives that might otherwise be missed. Later, perhaps serving as an advance messenger before formal meetings, helping prepare both sides for productive dialogue rather than confrontation. He gestured toward a document on his desk. I'm scheduled to meet with Kiowa representatives this afternoon, Kime among them. They're discussing hunting boundaries for the coming season. Your presence, if you're willing, would be valuable. Even today, Sarah felt a jolt of surprise. Kemi is here, at the fort? Wells nodded. With 3 other tribal leaders. They arrived yesterday. His gaze sharpened with interest. You know him personally? Yes, Sarah confirmed. He's Ahoti's uncle, the man I helped during the blizzard. Kemi was instrumental in welcoming me to their camp. A smile touched Wells's face. Then, your timing is fortuitous. Would you be willing to attend the meeting? Not as a formal representative, yet simply as an observer. Sarah considered the request, the opportunity to see Kemi again, to witness firsthand how these negotiations proceeded, might provide valuable insight before she committed herself fully to Wells's proposal. Yes, she decided. I would like that. Wells stood, clearly pleased. Excellent. The meeting begins in an hour. Captain Miller can show you to the officers' mess, where you might take some refreshment in the meantime. As they walked across the parade ground toward the mess hall, Miller maintained a respectful silence, allowing Sarah time to process the unexpected developments. Only when they had been served coffee and simple fare did he speak. Wells are unusual among Indian agents, he observed. Most view their position primarily as enforcing government policy, with little interest in the tribe's perspectives. Wells actually learns their languages, studies their customs, seeks to understand their concerns on their own terms. That seems a fundamental requirement for the role, Sarah replied. Yet you suggest it's rare. Miller's expression turned wry. Many government appointments have more to do with political connections than qualifications, Mrs. Collingwood. The frontier is often seen as a convenient posting for individuals who have fallen out of favor in Washington, but must still be accommodated somewhere, but not Wells. No, Miller confirmed. He requested this assignment specifically against the advice of those who believed it would end his career. He's convinced that a different approach is possible, one based on mutual understanding, rather than dominance and submission. Sarah considered this information, finding her respect for the agent increasing. It's an admirable vision, if difficult to implement given the history. All the more reason he needs people like you, Miller said, then added with unexpected candor. People who have demonstrated the courage to act on conviction rather than convention. Before Sarah could respond, a young lieutenant approached their table, addressing Miller. Sir, Agent Wells asked me to inform you that the Kiowa representatives have arrived early. They're being escorted to the meeting room now. Miller rose. Immediately. Thank you, Lieutenant. Please tell Agent Wells we'll join them shortly. He turned to Sarah. Are you ready, Mrs. Collingwood? She nodded, smoothing her travel-worn dress and wishing briefly that she had time to make herself more presentable. But perhaps there was appropriateness in meeting Keme as she was, a working woman of the frontier, practical rather than ceremonial in her appearance. The meeting room occupied the largest space in the administration building, a long chamber dominated by a central table surrounded by chairs. Maps covered one wall, their carefully drawn boundaries representing the government's attempt to impose order on territories whose indigenous inhabitants had never conceived of land as something to be divided by lines on paper. As Sarah entered, behind Miller, her gaze was immediately drawn to the 4 Kiowa men seated along one side of the table. Keme sat at their center, his dignified bearing unmistakable even in this unfamiliar setting. He wore a mixture of traditional clothing and items acquired through trade with settlers, a visual representation of the complex position tribal leaders now occupied, navigating between preservation of their culture and adaptation to changing realities. When Keme looked up and saw her, surprise momentarily disrupted his composed expression. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by something that might have been pleasure. He spoke quietly to his companions, whose attention immediately shifted to Sarah with evident interest. Wells approached, making formal introductions. "Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Sarah Collingwood, who has kindly agreed to observe our discussions today. Some of you may remember her from circumstances earlier this year." Keme stood, acknowledging Sarah with a dignified nod that conveyed more than words might. "We remember Neshoba," he said, using her Kiowa name with deliberate emphasis. "She is welcome at our council." The simple statement carried weight beyond its literal meaning, an acknowledgement of her status, an affirmation of connection that transcended the formal boundaries of the meeting. Sarah inclined her head in response, conscious of Wells and Miller watching the exchange with keen interest. "Thank you, Elder Keme," she replied, using his proper title. "I am honored to be remembered." Wells gestured for Sarah to take a seat, slightly removed from the main table, positioning her where she could observe without being directly involved in the negotiations. As the participants settled into their places, translators on both sides prepared to facilitate communication, though Sarah noted that Keme and at least one other Kiowa leader appeared to understand English without assistance. The meeting began, with formal statements of purpose, Wells outlining the government's proposal for hunting boundaries that would separate tribal territories from lands open to settler expansion. Maps were consulted, specific landmarks referenced, histories invoked to support competing claims. Sarah watched the proceedings with a growing understanding of the complexities involved. Wells demonstrated remarkable patience, genuinely listening to Kiowa concerns rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Keme and his fellow leaders presented their position with dignity and strategic skill, neither capitulating to government authority nor adopting confrontational stances that would derail productive dialogue. Midway through the afternoon, during a brief recess, Keme approached where Sarah stood by the window, observing the fort's activities in the late-day sun. "It is good to see you, Neshoba," he said quietly, his English careful but clear. "We have wondered how you fared among your people after returning." "Well enough," Sarah replied honestly. "Some understand, others question, but my path remains. My own." Keme nodded, appreciation in his eyes for her straightforward response. "Ahote asked me to carry a message, should our paths cross," he continued. "He says the wound healed cleanly, leaving only a mark to remember courage. Yours and his." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at this indirect communication from the man whose life she had saved, whose journey had so transformed her own. "I am glad to hear it. Is he well otherwise?" "He leads hunting parties now," Keme said, "with evident pride. The younger men follow him willingly. He has grown into his strength since the winter." Before Sarah could respond, Wells approached, his expression indicating curiosity about their exchange while respecting its privacy. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "We'll be resuming shortly." Keme acknowledged the agent with a slight nod. We were remembering shared paths, he explained. Nashoba walked with our people during difficult days. Such journeys are not forgotten. Wells's gaze moved between them, assessing the genuine connection evident in their interaction. I'm beginning to understand why Captain Miller spoke so highly of Mrs. Collingwood's potential contribution to our work, he observed. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with increasing focus on practical solutions rather than abstract principles. By the time darkness fell, tentative agreement had been reached on hunting boundaries that respected both Kiowa traditions and settler security concerns. Not a complete resolution to all points of contention, but progress built on mutual recognition of legitimate needs. As the participants prepared to depart, Kim approached Sarah once more, this time carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "For Nashoba," he said, offering it with formal dignity, "from our people to one who sees beyond boundaries." Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, Elder. Please convey my gratitude to all." "You will do this yourself, perhaps," Keme suggested, a knowing light in his eyes. "If your new path crosses ours again." He glanced meaningfully toward Wells, indicating awareness of the agent's interest in Sarah's potential role. Then, with a final nod of respect, he rejoined his companions for the journey back to their temporary camp beyond the fort's boundaries. Wells and Miller approached. As the Kiowa delegation departed, "That went better than I dared hope," Wells admitted. "Kemi is a skilled negotiator, but I've never seen him so willing to consider compromise." "Your approach invited cooperation rather than resistance," Sarah observed. "You listened rather than simply stating demands." "A sadly uncommon strategy in government dealings," Wells agreed with a wry smile, "but one I believe offers the only sustainable path forward." He studied her with undisguised interest. "Your connection with them is evident, Mrs. Collingwood. Have you made a decision regarding my proposal?" Sarah considered the day's events, the unexpected reunion with Keme, the glimpse into a process that might, if approached with genuine commitment on both sides, gradually heal divisions long assumed to be permanent. She thought of her isolated cabin, the limited horizons of Willow Creek, the life she had maintained rather than truly lived since James's death. Then she felt the weight of the medallion against her skin and the new gift from Keem in her hands. To be tangible reminders of a world beyond the boundaries she had once accepted as fixed and immutable. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like to accept the position if you still believe I can contribute meaningfully." Relief and satisfaction crossed Wells's face. "Excellent. We can discuss specific arrangements tomorrow after you've had time to rest from your journey." Later, alone in the small guest quarters Miller had arranged for her, Sarah carefully unwrapped Kem's gift. Inside the soft leather lay a bracelet of intricate beadwork, blues and whites forming a pattern she recognized from designs decorating. A pony's lodge. Alongside it was a small pouch containing seeds, unlike any she had seen before, and a folded piece of bark bearing a message in careful English. "For Nashoba's garden. Plants that heal wounds of body and spirit. May they grow strong in new soil." Sarah held the seeds in her palm, marveling at how life could emerge from such small beginnings. Like the chance encounter that had led her to find a Hote in the snow, or the unexpected proposal that now offered a new direction for her life, these tiny vessels contained possibility far beyond their humble appearance. She would plant them in her garden at home, nurture them alongside the familiar crops that sustained her physical needs. And in their growth, perhaps she would find metaphor for her own continuing transformation, from a woman defined primarily by what she had lost to one increasingly defined by what she had found. The following day brought detailed discussions, with Wells regarding her role, the compensation she would receive, the timeline for her involvement in upcoming negotiations. Practical matters that grounded her decision in reality rather than idealism alone. By midday, formal arrangements had been made. She would return to Willow Creek to set her affairs in order, then join Wells for a series of meetings with tribal representatives over the coming months. As she prepared to depart Fort Richardson for the journey home, Captain Miller approached, offering to escort her part of the way. "The situation remains unsettled in some areas," he explained. "An army escort would ensure your safe passage." Sarah recognized the offer as more than practical consideration. It was acknowledgement of her new status, a gesture of respect for the role she had accepted. "Thank you, Captain. I would appreciate the company." They rode west, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the vast landscape stretching toward horizons that seemed both farther and somehow more accessible than before. Miller maintained a companionable silence for much of the journey, only speaking when they approached the creek that marked her turn toward Willow Creek. "You've chosen an unconventional path, Mrs. Collingwood," he observed, drawing his horse to a halt. "Not everyone will understand or approve." "I'm aware," Sarah replied, "but understanding often begins with a single person willing to step beyond familiar boundaries." Miller nodded, a smile briefly lightening his serious countenance. "Well said. I believe Agent Wells has found a valuable ally in you." They parted ways at the creek crossing, Miller returning to his patrol route, Sarah continuing alone toward home. The land rolled gently beneath her horse's steady pace, early summer having transformed winter's stark palette into a canvas of greens and golds punctuated by wildflowers. Birds darted across her path, busy with the season's abundance, reminding her that life continued its cycles, regardless of human concerns or divisions. As she crested the final rise before her property came into view, Sarah reined her horse to a stop, taking a moment to observe her home from this slight distance. The cabin stood solid against the backdrop of prairie and distant hills, the fields she had planted showing the first green promise of crops to come. Smoke rose from the chimney. Ellen Jenkins had promised to check on things during her absence, lending the scene a welcoming air that tugged at Sarah's heart. This place would remain her anchor, the solid ground to which she could return between journeys into less certain territories. Her life would expand beyond its boundaries now, embracing new responsibilities and connections, but these familiar acres would continue to provide sustenance and shelter, a physical home to complement the spiritual one she had found in unexpected places. The wolf medallion warmed against her skin as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Sarah touched it briefly, a gesture that had become habit in moments of reflection, then urged her horse forward. There was much to prepare, many decisions to make regarding her property during the periods she would be away. The path ahead contained challenges she could only partially anticipate, but as she guided her mount down the gentle slope toward home, Sarah felt a certainty that transcended the practical concerns awaiting her attention. The woman who had once been defined by isolation, by the boundaries others established and she had accepted, now moved between worlds with growing confidence, carrying her Kiowa name like a truth finally recognized rather than a foreign concept imposed. Nashoba, wolf that sees far. With each step toward her cabin, watching the light change across familiar fields, seen now through transformed vision, Sarah embraced the name and all it represented, not just what she had been given, but what she had chosen to become. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.